think I really want people to kind of dive more into the idea of celebrating joy and fun as opposed to like just the things we need to do to survive. I think so long mental health conversations, and this is important, right? Like knowing the symptoms of anxiety and depression and like all of that stuff that we traditionally think about as mental health, like that is important. But I also want us to expand to think about mental wellness more, right? Like how are we playing? How are we engaging our sense of play as we get older? How do we really dig into our friendship circles and like center those relationships and not just romance? Like what kinds of things do we really need to be well and to thrive in our lives? And I really want Black women and Black girls to kind of think more about those pieces as well.
So, Dr. Joy, I want to thank you again for agreeing to speak with me for Black Women Talk Work. I'm very, very excited to have you on today's episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Myriha.
Absolutely. So we can dive right in. I know that your work has focused on really making mental health topics more relevant and accessible for Black women. Since launching therapy for Black girls in 2014, what is your overall assessment of just where Black women stand in terms of our collective awareness and ownership of our mental health?
Ooh, such a good question. I really feel like since 2014, and it's so weird and funny, I think, to think that this is like 10 years now, kind of coming up on the anniversary of therapy for Black girls. But I definitely have seen an increase in awareness about mental health and excitement. I definitely think more people are talking, at least more publicly, about like working with a therapist, sharing what they've learned in therapy, sharing that with family members as well as on like social media channels. And so I definitely think it is something that has grown. Like I feel like we have done a pretty good job at chipping away at some of the stigma that has been related to mental health. But I think that there's still a very long way to go. I think, you can't think in 10 years you'll change something that has been in existence, for, hundreds of years at this point. But I do think that we're in a very different place than we were 10 years ago.
And when you think about that, are there specific, or is there a specific area where you think we still have significant strides to make?
I think specifically as Black women, it is still related to kind of this superwoman syndrome and being very, I think that there is some honor for a lot of us that comes with this like strong label, and it has come with a lot of like benefits and I think maybe achievement and like all of these things that have had really positive consequences for us. And I don't think that we have always been able to kind of closely look at the negative impact it has had on us, especially as it relates to our mental health. And so I think there's still some work for us to be doing in terms of like letting go of this cape and like making ourselves a martyr to other people in our families, in our workspaces, and in our communities.
And you mentioned, and I found this so interesting when I was preparing for our conversation, that it was Black Girls Rock, BET's platform that really inspired you to create therapy for Black girls. What was it about that program that kind of made you, that sparked like, okay, Black women need a platform to prioritize their mental health?
So, I was already running groups for Black women students. So, my background is in college student mental health. And so, I've been on the campuses. My job, most immediately before Therapy for Black Girls, was my full time job, was as the director of the counseling center at Clark Atlanta University. But I've also been on the campuses of UGA, Virginia Commonwealth, Emory. So, I've been on lots of different campuses, and I would always run a group for the Black women students just because we know about the stigma and like how Black women were less likely than maybe some of their counterparts to actually come to the counseling center to receive services. And so it felt really important to create a space where they knew, like, hey, there's somebody in the counseling center that looks like me. I can have conversations that are relevant to me. And so I was already doing that work. And so I think when I saw Black Girls Rock, it just like magnified that for me in, just seeing like all these women in the room, and just celebrating one another and like cheering for one another and like highlighting some really important work that a lot of Black women were doing. And so I thought, wow, like it would be really cool to kind of give Black women this kind of a platform related to mental health. Like, how could I expand the kinds of conversations I'm already having on college campuses?
I love that because I thought that was so interesting, and it makes sense because I think like with Black Girls Rock, it was such a moment when I remember very vividly when that platform really first really began to pick up steam and was popular. It was such a moment. And so when I saw that it inspired therapy for Black girls in your work, I thought that was just like really very synergistic. It was aligned.
Yes.
It made sense. Let's talk a little bit about Black women and our relationship to work. And I know sometimes that this, and we'll talk a little bit about it within the realm of corporate, but just in general, I would say over the past decade, like almost parallel to the growing conversations around mental health, there has been this movement of more Black women being more open about the complex role that just work in general plays in their lives and its impact on our well-being. You know, what are some of the common themes that you hear Black women today bring up as mental health stressors regarding their relationship to work?
So I think the first one that comes to mind is microaggressions in the workplace. So these things, and I think people hear microaggressions and they think like, oh, that wasn't a small thing that happened. Micro doesn't necessarily mean that it was small in impact. It just means it was like a person to person kind of experience. And so I think microaggressions in the workplace are things that Black women, I think, and other people of color have experienced but didn't always have a name for. So these ideas that you would speak up and say something in a staff meeting and then it's overlooked, but then like a white woman would say the same thing and then people are like, oh my God, that's such a great idea, right? And so in a lot of ways, I think Black women have felt invisible in the workplace. I think that, there have been, it feels like there's this shared experience of Black women having performance evaluations where there's some kind of comment about us feeling aloof in the workplace, or she doesn't kind of play well with others because we're maybe not in the break room sharing everything about our weekends and like those kinds of things. And so I think those kinds of things gradually chip away at your confidence and your ability to actually do good work in a workspace. And so I think microaggressions is one that kind of comes to mind quickly. I think also because Black women are often kind of socialized. I mean, many of us have parents and grandparents who told us that we had to work twice as hard to get half as much, right? And so we often take that into the workspace. And so we are often overachievers. But I think what that means is that it doesn't always, like, the overachievement that you do in the workplace doesn't always keep up with like salary or promotion and title. And so a lot of us are doing a lot of work in a workspace but not actually getting fairly compensated or properly recognized, which I think again just chips away at your confidence and your morale for being in a workplace. And so I think those are the two things that come to mind most easily for me.
And a lot of that goes back to just psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically when I think about like within the corporate space, there's a lot of conversation around and data to back up that Black women don't always feel like they're in a psychologically safe space within a corporate work environment. What does workplace trauma typically look like in Black women? Because it's so interesting. Literally, right before our conversation started, I was scrolling on TikTok and a young Black woman, she was talking about when she started in corporate and she started kind of having the feelings of just like not enjoying the experience, feeling some of the microaggressions, just not feeling like it was the safest environment for her. When she started having these conversations with other Black women in her life, her friends, her family members, it was almost as if no one wanted to openly talk about it. It was almost as if every people in her life were in a mindset of we're in it, we have to play the game, play the role. We need to be here, so there's no point in like kind of talking about or dwelling on the stuff that we already know is happening. In my mind, I was like, that sounds like trauma, especially when I think about like older generations, like my mom's generation, my grandmother's generations. What does workplace trauma typically look like in Black women? And I would almost even say just from a generational lens too.
I mean, there's a lot of truth to what you just shared. I do think, so many of the systems that we find ourselves in are outreaches of slavery, right? I mean, and so when we think about just the idea that you kind of have to go someplace for 40 hours a week at least, right? Like you think about like there is no balance, so because a lot of your week is typically spent at work. And so if these are places that are not kind of invested in your wellness, places where you can kind of take time off when you need to, that can be traumatic in a lot of ways. And again, I think a lot of us have been talked to in very horrible ways in the workplace. I think generationally speaking, a lot of our moms and grandmothers like stayed in jobs far longer than they would, under normal circumstances because they had to do what they had to do to keep the lights on or, to provide for their family. And so I think when we think about, I think it was really cool, I think, and interesting about like Gen Z and like some of the younger people in the workforce is that they are kind of opening their eyes to like, I don't really like this and I don't think I need to put up with it. Right. And so I think that it provides some interesting and sometimes tense conversations and interactions, I think, with older generations, because so many of them have been kind of taught this idea that you have to stay in a job no matter what, right? Like we hear these jokes about like these good government jobs and like, I'm never leaving this job because it has good benefits, the paycheck comes on time, right? And I think younger people are just saying like, that's not enough for me. And I think it kind of intertwines with our earlier conversation around like how so many young people are already aware of like mental health concerns, right? Like our parents and grandparents didn't necessarily have language or weren't talking about it in the same ways that we are. And so I think the intersection between workplace stuff and mental health is really creating some different kinds of experiences for younger people in the workplace where they're making decisions very early on about this doesn't feel like a place that is like psychologically safe for me.
And I know that there are many who say and that arguably you cannot self-care your way out of a toxic work environment, but I do believe that there is a sense of empowerment that comes with owning and having your own self-care strategy specifically related to navigating work, and whether it's helping you get through until you find a new opportunity or until you make a pivot, whatever it is. What are some of the self-care strategies that from your perspective and that you've seen Black women successfully incorporate in order to kind of navigate these complex work environments?
Mariah, that is such a good point. Like, you cannot self care your way out of a toxic environment, right? But I think what often happens is that, again, because we often spend so much time at work, that our identity becomes to be wrapped up in our jobs, which then makes it difficult to separate this toxic environment from like something that you are doing to create it, right? And so I think a lot of the self care strategies really come from recognizing that you are in this environment, but that it doesn't mean anything about you, right? Because I think when you're getting these bad remarks on your performance evaluation or you're being left off of emails, like it can, again, it really erodes your self esteem and like your ability to do your work. And so I think being able to recognize this as, I know that this is not about me, that this is something system wide that they have going on. And I need to provide for my family right now. And so I'm staying here until I find something else, right? I think that that is a huge self care strategy, is to have agency over the idea that you are in this environment, but that is not anything that you are doing that is making you get the bad remarks or making it so that you are passed over for promotions. I also think it's really important to make sure that you are cultivating other spaces in your life that have nothing to do with work. Because I think it can get really easy. It can be really easy to like spend 40 hours a week at work, then go to, lunch and dinner after work and spend time talking about what happened at work. And then you have basically a day and a half on the weekends to kind of recover, right? And it's
Yep.
simply not enough. And so you have to be very, very intentional about, I think, setting good boundaries with your workspace. If you are able to like take email off your phones or not be responsive to things after you leave the office or after you log out if you're still working virtually, I think that that's really important. And then have other things that you are really cultivating in your life. So hobbies, other interests, time with friends and family, like all of those things, I think help to kind of give you a fuller experience of your life as opposed to just thinking about your life as when you have to clock in and clock out of your job.
Mm. Love that, Dr. Joy. And you talk about like the system, right? And the system of the corporate world, of the workplace. From that lens, what should organizations be doing to foster an environment of safety, specifically for Black women? Because I think there are, especially within like the corporate DE and I conversation, I think sometimes companies will take an approach where they just kind of blanket initiatives to target men, underrepresented communities like LGBTQ, like it'll just kind of blanket initiatives. But there is this layer of there needing to be a tailoring, because like the experiences of Black women, of Latino women, of Asian women, of gay, straight, like there are so many nuances in all of our experiences. From your perspective, what are some of the things that organizations should be doing to create a safe space for Black women?
I think a lot of that starts with looking at your leadership, right? Because if your leadership is not diverse, and that doesn't mean like having one Black woman in leadership, because, we are not a monolith. And so we know that one Black woman cannot speak for all of the experiences of all Black women. But I think if there is more diversity in your leadership, then you are actually more likely to be able to have voices at the table that can kind of speak to the different needs that different communities have. And I think it's not enough to just have them there, but actually allow them to be spokespeople for different concerns, right? Because I think, you have one Black woman, one straight, gay person, like that is not enough if they are just kind of a figurehead. But are they actually able and feel safe enough themselves to kind of bring forth the concerns that they're seeing maybe with the communities they are a part of? So I think it really starts with leadership. You can't have an all straight white man leadership team and then think that like people are going to feel safe there. Like it's just not, I don't think, possible if you are not actually investing power into people who actually represent diverse communities. I also think having mechanisms where people can provide feedback, and this is more, I think, at the managerial level than like your, senior leadership, but people need to be able to kind of talk about how they're feeling and how they're experiencing their workplace without managers getting defensive. Because I think what often happens is that a manager will, kind of react to like, oh, are you calling me racist? Or, those kinds of things. Well, I mean, you might be racist, but can you also relax your own defenses enough to say, okay, even though this may not be my experience in the workplace, I'm hearing from other team members that this is their experience. And so that means that something different needs to be done. And I think being able to allow some kind of mechanism for feedback that is not able to connect who said what is really important, because a lot of times there will be like these anonymous surveys that are sent out, but if it's only one Black girl on the team, like if there are Black concerns that come up, then it was her that likely said it, right? And so I think having mechanisms where people can actually anonymously provide feedback, and that other people's defenses, well, your defenses can get activated, but you don't act out of them, I think is really, really important for, to be able to create safe spaces, especially for Black women.
And I'm so glad that you brought up like specifically the role of managers and the role of that relationship, because I think I realized probably early in my career, like from my own experiences as well as the experiences of just like friends and other Black women around me, that that manager relationship is really make or break. And I feel like there's more understanding of this now, but you know, I feel like previously there was not a lot of understanding around the fact that as a manager, the way that you would manage a Black woman or a Latino woman or a lesbian, like the way that you would manage them, there's a degree of cultural sensitivity and just like competency that is required. And, I feel like that layer is sometimes even still lost, of like the importance of a manager being able to have these like tough conversations.
Absolutely. And I think, some of that, so much of that is like checking in with your own stereotypes about who Black women are. So all of these ideas that, like if we are like expressing our ideas that we are being too assertive or we are intimidating in some ways. But is it that we're intimidating, or is it that you just feel intimidated by somebody who is very clear on their opinion and has a very clear idea about how work needs to happen? And so I think there's a lot of self work that needs to be done that people, I don't think, recognize. And I don't think that there's always like really good training for how people become managers and like how much of your own stuff gets activated when you actually are managing people. Like I think that there's a lot of psychology behind what it takes to actually be a good manager and to make sure that you are kind of checking in with yourself, like, how am I reacting to this Black woman person that I'm managing versus another white woman that I may be managing or a white man that I'm managing? Like, there's a lot of your own stuff that gets kind of kicked up, which I think is why it could be important to be in therapy for yourself or for workplaces to really invest in like manager training kinds of programs so that people can actually talk about these things that greatly impact the ways that they are managing their team.
And I want to click like a layer deeper into this conversation, and specifically around, like, I know over probably over the past year, we've seen, Black women who are in these like higher DEI leadership C-suite positions. Some of them have been let go over the past year, and many of them were appointed amid this, quote unquote racial reckoning after the public execution of George Floyd in 2020. And of those who remain in these roles, they are now battling against this like very complex societal and political backlash against all things DE&I, and how that impacts their work at their organization. When I first started this podcast, I spoke a lot and primarily with Black women in DEI positions because I had a lot of just like curiosity about what it was like to be a Black woman in that role. And, they're on the front lines of some of the most challenging, and I would even argue sometimes some of the most traumatic work within an organization. They're trying to change systems, and arguably there's a little bit of also trying to change hearts and minds. How can women in these roles specifically cultivate mental wellness, particularly in today's climate? And what can they do to kind of mentally and emotionally prepare for the challenges that may come?
Ooh, that is such a great point that you mentioned, Mariah. And I think that that is such important work, right? Like, I think a lot of us find ourselves, many of us who I think are firmly rooted in like the Black community and like have this passion to kind of change systems for the better, I think often find ourselves in these spaces where we may be the only one or like one of few. And I do think we have to look at how that impacts our mental health because it's not easy. And so I think, to our earlier conversation about making sure that you are very clear that any toxic environment you find yourself in is not actually an indication of you. That is, you're likely going to get a lot of criticism, a lot of, negative feedback. People are not going to be super accommodating sometimes and open to the things that you have to say, but to do what you can while you're there. And so I think having a peer group of other women who maybe are in similar situations, right? Like, are there other DEI leaders that you can connect with outside of your organization so that there is a place where people understand exactly what you are dealing with, I think is really, really important because I think it also can be very lonely and isolating. And so being able to connect with other people who get the kind of work that you're trying to do, I think is really important. Again, I also think it's important to have a peer support and like a support circle that has nothing to do with your job, so that you can just be whoever, like your college girlfriends or sorority sisters or people in your community or church communities. Like having a place where you are not on, so to speak, I think is really, really important. And I don't know how you could do that kind of work without having a therapist, because just in like trying to run my own company or being a part of the 9 to 5 workforce, it's really important to have somebody like who is not in all the other areas of your life to be able to check in with you, to be able to kind of connect some patterns across the things that you're saying, and a place to kind of just let it all go and not have any worries about it getting back to senior leadership or any of those kinds of things. I think having a therapist as a part of your care team is really, really important.
From your perspective, and I kind of touched on this, like the general just backlash against DE&I that's happening right now. As a mental health professional, what concerns you the most about this very public attempt to roll back DEI efforts, specifically in the workplace?
It's really disappointing, Mariah, and I would say disheartening. I don't know that I had any magical thinking that like things were going to change completely for the better after 2020, but it did feel like we were making some progress, right? And I think now the backlash has been so swift and so like severe that I think it's really hard to kind of stay hopeful. in a lot of ways. And so I think hopelessness is probably at an all-time high in a lot of ways for people. And I also think it to me it is such a like element misunderstanding of like what makes good business, right? Like
Yep.
there's all this research that talks about like how Black people are like such fierce supporters of brands that they feel like support their community, and where like Black people are in leadership. Like there's all this research that talks about like how it actually makes good sense for the business. And so to see people like making decisions that are actually against their business goals to me is just so ridiculous. But, again, we are talking about a system that is really built on white supremacy. And so anything that looks like white people do not have kind of power over everybody else, I think that that is where people are trying to kind of tap back into now. And so I just encourage people to try to continue to be hopeful and to, again, look for places where achievement and validation can come in places that are not your workplace, because it's very likely that that's not going to be in the workplace anymore. I also think that that is why we are seeing such a shift in people kind of exploring entrepreneurship, and kind of looking at ways that they can kind of support themselves and their families that have nothing to do with, working in some of these larger corporate spaces.
And because for me, it goes back to your point of just like psychological safety. I think when I think about DE&I now, to me, it boils down to this is the organization's commitment to creating a safe environment for you. And so when we're pulling away these initiatives, it's essentially saying, I am no longer committed and investing in making sure that this is a safe space for you to work every day. And when you put it like that, it's like, it's
You
just,
got to read the writing on
it's,
the wall. Yeah, like you have some decisions
yeah,
to make, I think, about
yeah.
whether this is a place that actually is going to even be safe enough for you to even do any kind of work to provide for your family, right? Because I do think there is a cost, of course, like we do have, we have to provide for ourselves and our families, but at what cost? And I think that there are other things that you can do for income that maybe are not as psychologically taxing if it really only comes down to like being able to support yourself. Because sometimes it's just not worth it. And sometimes the psychological hit you can take in some of these spaces is something that's really difficult to come back from.
And, as we are a few months out from another presidential election, and I can very vividly remember where I was as far as like work in my career at the last presidential election and the aftermath. You know, what is your advice as far as preparing to kind of navigate and protect our mental health as we potentially see the outcome of this election, regardless of what direction it ends up bleeding into our workplace? Because I kind of felt like with the last election, at least where I was at in my career, I feel like a lot of people were caught off guard. A lot of organizations, I will say that, but were caught off guard with how people wanted to talk about what was happening, and even just like the aftermath. So, from your perspective, how can organizations show up to support during this time, and how can we as individuals just kind of prepare ourselves for these conversations coming up in the workplace in November?
Yeah, I think organizations do themselves a disservice and their people a disservice when they are not prepared to have these kinds of conversations. So the idea that you could separate enough like politics from like your humanity and like, oh, we just don't talk about that at work. Like how do we not? And so I think being prepared to have some of those conversations is going to be really important for team members themselves. I think looking at whether you can kind of work remotely that day or like be out of the office or doing something else, because we don't know, right? And I think that there is often a large aftermath of activity and like heightened feelings depending on which way the election goes. And so I think kind of checking out a little bit or being kind of off site is probably not the worst idea. But I also think as organizations, like looking at being able to bring in mental health professionals to help people process their emotions, or making sure people are aware of of EAP resources that may be provided, because there is a lot of stuff that gets activated for people personally related to political elections. And so I think being an organization that is mindful about that, I think that also communicates psychological safety, that I am thinking about you as more than just what you can bring to this company, but as you being a whole human and, somebody that I want to be well. I think having those kinds of resources available is a really good idea.
And so I want to pivot a little bit because I know you recently published your first book, Sisterhood
Mhm.
Heals. And you've kind of talked about this already in our conversation, but when you think about relationships and you think about friendships and you think about specifically in the work world, there's having mentors and sponsors and what should that tribe of supporters look like for Black women in terms of navigating and growing their career? I feel like there are a lot of different perspectives on this, but from a maintaining a healthy mental state, what do you think that tribe should look like?
Yeah, so I get really disappointed when I hear younger Black women having negative experiences with older Black women in the workplace. Because I think for so many of us, for so many of the reasons that we've already talked about, when we find ourselves in some of these spaces where there are not a lot of us, I think a lot of us look to like older Black women to kind of be like our guideposts and like, okay, they're going to help me navigate this space. And sadly, that isn't always the case. And I think, again, that is rooted in white supremacy, this idea that there can only be one of us that is successful. And so I can't help to kind of open the door for you, because does that mean my position is going to be taken away? But I think that there is a way for us to create a very different system, even within this system, which is that I get in this position and then I'm throwing the door open for as many people as possible to come behind me. And I think that is actually what psychological safety looks like. It looks like you being maybe the more senior person who has kind of navigated the terrain a little bit, knows enough about the system to be able to bring a younger person in to mentor them and to encourage them, like, okay, these are the kind of people you got to be aware of. Like this is kind of like how you navigate the system. And I think that because we still find ourselves in these places where there are not many of us, that is the way to kind of go, is to be able to kind of mentor younger people throughout the process. And then those younger people then keeping the door open for other people. And so I think having support systems within the workplace of other people who kind of know the players, right? And, the meeting after the meeting, I think is really critically important for Black women, right? Like to be able to process something that just happened in the staff meeting and to realize, okay, I wasn't the only one who saw that, right? Like those kinds of things, I think all contribute to psychological safety for Black women in the workplace.
I love that point of like the meeting after the meeting. That love that. Spot on. And when you think about, because I feel like right now too, and I'll frame this question within the context specifically of like 30 something to 40 something year olds, because I feel like when you're in your 20s, you're kind of encouraged to explore your career and pivot and do a lot of different things. But there is this idea that when you reach your 30s or your 40s, you should be settled into your career. You should kind of have your path set. And I think it was on a recent episode of the Therapy for Black Girls podcast, and I'm blanking on the therapist's name, but she talked about shoulding all over yourself, right? Being obsessed with like the should, what you should be doing, what you should have at this point. For those 30 something, 40 something year olds who are at a crossroads in their career, whether they're contemplating a pivot in a new industry or starting their own business or a creative venture, what mental health check-ins should they be doing as they prepare that new journey or along the journey to kind of ensure that they are making decisions from a place that is just mentally healthy and not from a place of like carrying workplace trauma?
Dr. Melissa Robinson Brown is the therapist that you're talking
Mm,
about. Yeah, so
okay.
she, gave excellent information, because I do think we should on ourselves a lot, right? Like there are all these ideas
Mhm.
that typically come from society or older people in our family about what our lives and our career should look like. And I think I'm excited to see so many people kind of saying, well, do I actually believe that? Like, I'm going along this path, but is this really something I want for myself? And I think one of the things when you are kind of considering a career pivot, which I encourage, right? Like, I think gone are the days where we kind of retire from the company that we worked, we started out after undergrad. Like, that is just not happening anymore. And I think it's always good to kind of explore your interest in the different kinds of things that may be a good fit for you. One of the things I think to be aware of, though, is to be mindful of who you are sharing this information with. Because a lot of times when we have like these big dreams or what feels like a magical kind of idea, we will share that with people whose fears and insecurities get activated and then they project that onto us. So me saying like I want to start this new company and telling that to, maybe my aunt who kind of did retire from the job that she graduated from or went to right after undergrad. That may tap into for her all the chances that she didn't take, all the dreams that she kind of let go, and they can't actually support you in this thing that you're very excited about. And so I would encourage people to be very careful with who you share your dreams and big ideas with, because you might find yourself kind of stalling on it just because you shared it with somebody who couldn't actually support you and get excited with you about it. So finding another group of people, then these may be people that you find kind of on the journey. It might not be, your friends that you kind of have always had. It could be other people who are big dreamers who can actually support you and, help connect you to the resources you need to take these next steps. I also think we get in our way by not actually asking for help. So there is a lot that you're likely not going to know about this new pivot that you are looking into. And that means that you have to open your mouth and say, hey, I don't know it all. Or, hey, I need some help, which I think can be really hard for Black women, right? Like, again, for all the reasons we've talked about, like we are kind of socialized to overperform and be the one in our communities, in our circle who knows it all. But when you're going into a new space, you likely won't have all the answers. And so I think getting out of your own way and asking for help and being vulnerable to let people know that you're kind of stuck in a place, I think is something that can really help as you are exploring this pivot in your career.
And when you reflect on your own incredible career and building therapy for Black girls, like what has kept you centered and mentally healthy throughout this experience over the past decade?
Yeah, yeah. So I think some of the things that I've already talked about. So I have a really close support
Yeah.
circle of girlfriends who have nothing to do with therapy for Black girls. Like they are my college
Mm,
friends, and so I think that they really help me to stay grounded and like to focus on like the kinds of things that are really important. So they are a huge part of like my care plan. I have my own therapist who I have worked with for years. So every Tuesday you will find me in her virtual office. And there's so much.
yes.
I did not anticipate like how much therapy space entrepreneurship would actually take up. Again, I
Mhm.
just didn't know because I wasn't an entrepreneur. And so there are all these things around like perfectionism and control that I did not necessarily know I had issues with that have come up as a result of me being an entrepreneur. And so having my own therapist to talk about those kinds of things has been really important. I also think that's something that has really helped me to be successful with therapy for Black girls is staying connected to the community that this work is for, because I am not super driven by like revenue goals and like those kinds of things, though it is important because I have a team who helps me with the work of therapy for Black girls and I want to continue to be able to support them. But I'm more connected to like what kinds of conversations our community is thinking are relevant and what kinds of support services and resources do they need to be well. And so I think staying really connected to the community and staying connected to the why of the work is really what has led to a lot of the success of therapy for Black girls.
And can I just say, I love the pop culture tie-ins on the podcast. I just think it's just so smart. It's just like, I love it so much. It gets me excited because it's just such a smart way to like just make therapy and the content even more accessible and relatable. And I feel like we don't see a lot of people really trying to educate in that way, really trying to, because by incorporating like the pop culture, you make it's able to kind of cross
Yes.
generations, and it's I just think that's such an incredible value add. So I just want to add that in there.
You. I love that because I spend so much time like it feels like the blending of both of the things I love most. I spend so much time like watching things and like being on TikTok and like, like really in pop culture. And so being able to kind of tie that with the mental health piece has been so much fun. So I appreciate you for saying that.
Absolutely. And I want to do a quick speed round before we wrap, but I do have one last
Okay.
question for you. When you think about the next decade of the Therapy for Black Girls platform, what do you hope Black women and girls continue to take away from it?
I think I really want people to kind of dive more into the idea of celebrating joy and fun as opposed to like just the things we need to do to survive. I think so long mental health conversations, and this is important, right? Like knowing the symptoms of anxiety and depression and like all of that stuff that we traditionally think about as mental health, like that is important. But I also want us to expand to think about mental wellness more, right? Like how are we playing? How are we engaging our sense of play as we get older? How do we really dig into our friendship circles and like center those relationships and not just romance? Like what kinds of things do we really need to be well and to thrive in our lives? And I really want Black women and Black girls to kind of think more about those pieces as well.
I love that. You hit home with that one. So I love that. Okay, so I want to get into a quick speed round. And it does not have to, I always say it doesn't have to be speedy. Please take your time, answer as you see fit. The first one, what is the worst professional advice you've ever received?
The worst professional advice. I can't think of any personal advice, but I will say I kind of cringe when I hear people say, like just be yourself in the workplace because we've already talked about like how so many places are not built for Black women to actually be themselves. And I think it is okay to have a version of you that shows up in the workplace and that you leave the fullness of you for those spaces where you are able to be embraced and validated and affirmed.
What about the best professional advice?
I think the best professional advice I've received is from a business coach, Maya Elias, who I worked with very early in the beginning of Therapy for Black Girls, that talked about there's often a message that comes through you that is not for you. And so when I kind of get in my head around like perfectionism or really anxious about like how are people going to receive this, to know that there's somebody on the other side who needs what it is that I have to offer or what I have to say, and I need to get out of my own way to share it.
I love that one. I really love that one. Coffee or tea?
Tea, sweet tea specifically.
I love it. Early mornings or late
Late
nights?
nights, I'm very much a 2 a.m. emailer. Yes.
Really? See, I feel like I used to be, but I feel like I've now transitioned to like early
Really?
mornings. It kind of, yeah, it's just like stages of my life. Personal power color.
Ooh, coral.
Oh, we haven't gotten that answer yet. I love
Yes.
that. Beautiful. I love that. I love that. A favorite book, podcast, or tech tool that has helped you in your career?
Ooh, I will say do not disturb on my devices is probably my favorite thing. Like, when I realized I could just not be available to people, like, game changer.
That's a real good one. I like that one, Dr. Joy. I love that. And lastly, your favorite social media platform, Instagram, Twitter, X, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn, or none.
This is so interesting. So I would have to say Twitter, but like old Twitter, like before
Mm,
Elon Twitter. And though there's still some semblance of that, I just think it is the
it's
best
different.
place to kind of stay connected to like what's actually happening in the moment. And it has been, like some of my biggest, like I first got a chance to be quoted in Essence because one of the writers found me on Twitter. And so I feel like it also was a platform that really helped to kind of change my career and open up some opportunities. So I would have to say Twitter.
I love that. Well, that wraps up our conversation, Dr. Joy. I just want to thank you again so much. This has been just a fantastic conversation. And I knew it would be. Like, I've followed your work for a very long time, and it's such an honor to have had a chance to speak with you. And I just want to say thank you so, so much. And this has been a pleasure.
Likewise, Mariah, I've really enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you so much for having me.